Well, everyone, all of you, I don't see you, but I know you're there. So many people have arrived. Thank you so much for accompanying us. Let me welcome you to this dialogue of DMD Mexico. These are various dialogues. I think this is the fourth one on the right to die with dignity without pain and suffering. Today, we are going to be talking about pain and suffering. For that, we have two excellent speakers, first level speakers. Margarita Araujo Navarrete, thank you so much for being with us. Francis, of course, you're part of the family. Thank you so much for discussing such a crucial issue, such an important topic. On my part, what I thought I could do give you a context of this subject matter. I found like five different items I could use to give you the context. As of my own, sorry, I have a little bit of a cough. As of my own experience as a psychoanalyst, a lot of testimonies we've gathered from people who've suffered or who've seen other people, so many people suffer. And I will do this from my own readings, of course, and my own quota of pain and sufferings. I believe that no one escapes suffering. All human beings suffer and have suffered at a certain point of their lives, of our lives. I was thinking, what is the genesis of pain? Where did it start? And I think humankind, the way we know it, cannot be understood without pain. Humankind is a synonym of pain. And we don't understand it without efforts we've always made as human beings to palliate pain, to end with suffering. So they go hand in hand. What I don't even know, this is my final conclusion. What would we be without pain? I think it would be absolutely something we cannot even imagine living without some type of pain. And this is something that I've seen. Pain is part of our essence. I mean, we have the gene for pain since we're born in paradise, for instance. You can imagine a paradise with pain. There's a desire Adam had to discover between good and evil. That's part of our own nature, and it's part of our own genes and everything. And pain means punishment, of course. And women, we we have our children with pain, and men also work with the sweat and the pain they suffer. So that's where pain really started in paradise. And I think pain is an oceanic topic. We can never stop talking about pain, which has no end. It's an abyss. It's something that has no depth to it, no end to it. And the speakers will tell us about this better than myself. However, there's so much pain, but we do not know much about pain. When can we start suffering? You go to the hospital, and the doctor, they will take all your suffering and pain away. This is the way we think when we arrive at the hospital. This is not true. Margarita will tell us about this. And what I know, as far as I know, that there is not in schools, they don't teach pain. There's no class on pain at the university level, ever, anywhere. And not much research being done on pain that I know of, at least. And we'll say how much painkillers does a person need to stop suffering, for instance. In testimonials that I've been able to hear from people, or people sending us their texts on pain, frequently, this is the phrase I find. Doctors would tell patients, that's the way this is going to be. That's life. That's the pain. That's what your illness is all about. And there's no palliative. And I thought, my goodness, so they don't even know what to say. They don't know what to do about pain. We do not have all the knowledge about pain. We don't know where does pain come from? Why does it come to start with? Because the way I see it, there are many examples in history of people who've never felt pain in their lives. And there are also people who say, well, they break a leg or something and it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt a bit. You see, childbearing sometimes doesn't even hurt. And they say, well, this is sometimes people's nerves are affected and people have no pain even then. So we don't even know what pain is really all about. What is pain? Sometimes we take it as something we can solve like a puzzle. We can figure out. And they said 2 + 2 is 4, and that's it. Well, I think from what I have seen is that pain is a mystery. That's what it is. Pain is a mystery. We do not know exactly what pain is. It's always interrogating us, it's always questioning us. Pain is. So we're not yet capable of understanding what it is or what is it for. It can't. He had doubt. It can't. Of course, this philosopher, he could control his gout pain through his concentration. He would think of other things, so he wouldn't have. But imagine this philosopher. But most of us are not like him. We cannot control pain through concentration. So one of the things that I also think it's difficult to understand is this division, this between physical pain and emotional or mental pain. Emotional pain, that's what I mean. Why this division? Sometimes those divisions are very arbitrary. Where do you separate where physical from emotional pain? Where is the separation? Where is this divide? William Blake say, well, this is something intellectual. This is the anima, the soul. You cannot separate the physical pain from an emotional pain. You see, that's what Blake said. As a psychoanalyst, well, this is something that we already heard. You have people that come to see you because they have love pain. They are suffering because they're lacking love. And this such a strong pain that it disables them from, they cannot even get up. They have this terrible depression. It's very deep pain, very profound. I mean, what's worse, a broken leg than the love, the pain for love or because of love, lack of love. So this difference between physical, emotional pain, I think those topics are so many things we don't know about. There are so many things we do not know about. So this definition of pain as a mystery is an interesting definition, something we can relate to because sometimes you get other options. Not only, well, I have these nerves that are hurting me. Who knows what's really hurting you? Then you're going to be able to walk. Sometimes you're afraid to walk once more because of the pain you felt. So pain is really a major topic. And I think what's happened is that it's medicalized to a certain degree. The only people in charge of pain right now are doctors, the medics. And you see, you have a pain, so you go see the doctor. That's a logical thing to do. If you have a toothache, well, you go see the dentist. But pain itself has many other facets, many other stages. And the definition of pain is something that escapes us. And I think that this is where we can really use literature. There are so many works talking about pain, poems, for instance, films you can watch and see talking about. So, how do you vitalize the pain? That's too reductionist. This is what you should take. This is the painkiller, and your pain is over. I think this is a very reductionist position. Dostoevsky, Death of Ivan Ilyich, I'm sure you've read it. This is a description of pain better than any other description I have ever found from Dostoevsky. And he says, remember that? Well, pain comes to you very silent. You can, roll down the stairs and nothing happens. But 3, 4, 5, 7 days after you fell, then you start feeling pain. And your personality changes because all of a sudden you didn't feel it at the beginning, but now it has incubated in you. Pain is something that incubates in you. It started, someone fell and he felt nothing. So this description is quite fascinating. how slowly pain moves, like moisture. It moves little by little, and sometimes, people start alienating themselves when they're in pain. They don't want to see anyone, they are isolated. And Tolstoy spoke about this so much. And then the part of screaming and howling, this howling of people with pain. You could hear the howling streets away from this person suffering. There was no way of stopping this howling from this person. And this continued until, well, and this is the other context I want to talk about, the significance, the meaning of pain. Ivan Illich has this approach, a spiritual change. And all of a sudden, it's like a click, you see, the pain disappears. And he says, well, what's happening is death. Pain and death are linked sometimes. And the poetry is very good. Emily Dickinson, I'm sure you've read Emily Dickinson, and she wrote in her poems, she said, it has a friend, and the friend of pain is death. And you think of something, so many stages of pain until you reach death, perhaps. Well, the politics of pain, the politics of pain, this is quite an evident thing. There are like two ways of facing this pain socially or politically. Well, the liberal or conservative way of facing pain. There are many ways of facing pain. There's an important part, and this can be translated into many social policies, public policies as well, according to the government. And the government officials, they decide how people should be facing pain. The Second World War, for instance, how pain became a very subjective thing, and you could start the pain of others, the sufferings of others. So public policies were designed according to the way pain was being seen publicly. Does it really hurt you? But it's different when someone else is hurting, not you yourself. Well, Reagan, for instance, public policies changed with Ronald Reagan, and the courts started deciding things. When should pain be treated this way? When should pain be treated that way? And those were the judges, the justices, and the courts deciding that. So these policies really determine how we see pain, what is hurting us, what is not hurting us. I'm sure that you will remember that they used to say that black slaves did not feel pain, and like the white felt pain. So there was a lot of freedom to, have the surgery and treat black women slaves, because they said we can treat them in whichever way we want, and they're never going to suffer. We can beat them up and they don't suffer. They're black and they're women and they're slaves. So this is an issue here related to pain. And apparently, you know, the experiment where the black population went through a lot of experiments because they had syphilis. And when they had the cure, they didn't give them the cure because they wanted to continue with this experiment with the black population with syphilis. Well, so they ended up asking for their forgiveness. They apologized because of what had happened in this experiment. So this is a significant change. Progress is being made, but not completely. Right now, as you see, similar things are happening. Someone said the other day, and I think this is very significant, there's a difference between rich people and poor people, people with money and people with no money. The rich people have a pain and they go cure it tomorrow. The next day, they find the painkiller immediately. However, people with no economic resources have to wait. They have to wait a long time with the pain. And they have to wait for someone, like the people, the testimonials that I mentioned. They go from one doctor to the other, from one place to the other, to see why they have this pain, what medicine they can take, what government service they can use where they don't have to pay. We're not in slave times right now, but even now, this is quite an evident thing. the divide between the rich and the poor, especially with this pandemic. There are those who can stay home with COVID-19, others have to go out, others don't have to go to the clinic, whatever. So this is another aspect of the public management of pain. And I think this is key in our analysis. These are some of the ideas that I was having when I thought of talking to you to start this very important seminar. I was thinking of all these similarities of the political part, the social part of pain. What is the significance we give pain? Because if you give the significance, for instance, or the meaning, saying that you're going to save yourself, this is salvific, well, you're going to heaven. So, why worry about it if you're going to end up in heaven after suffering? So, how far can we talk about palliative to take pain away? This is something that I mentioned. What would the world be without pain? Well, I wish I would have been asking this, but Plato was already asking this. Plato was asking this question. He said, what are we going to do? He was asking this in one of his dialogues. I don't remember exactly which one of Plato's dialogues this was, but he said, would you change not having pain and suffering? But if you don't have pain and suffering, you're not going to have emotions. If you don't have pain and suffering, you're not going to have enthusiasm. You will not have sentiments and feelings if you don't have pain and suffering. Plato said that in one of the dialogues. And this is very, very important. How far can we go? Well, I'm a psychoanalyst and I think about this. What about pain and grief when you lose someone, a loved one? So this can go to extremes. And this, of course, you're not an automated being. I mean, this is... it's an absolute reaction of humankind. You suffer with pain. And this has to do with the last extremes of pain itself. Well, U.S. Paper, an article that I read, they were asking the readers in this newspaper, and they had many answers. I was really surprised at the answer people were giving because they were talking about pain. And the way I thought of it, the way Plato saw it, they said, no, we don't believe that. Can we eliminate pain? Can we eliminate love? We love someone and then we don't love someone, so we have pain. Do we eliminate love because of that reaction we're going to have of suffering when we stop loving? Well, palliating pain, that's it has been our task. That has been our task. Maybe we're always trying to eliminate so much pain in the Bible. Job, for instance, he kept all his pains. Then he offered them to God, and God was awarding him for having suffered so much in the name of God. And so then, pain has so many faces. I would recommend us really to learn more about pain and for us to try to penetrate the meanings of pain, our own pain. We've experienced what has happened to us, what is happening with so much pain throughout the world and in our own lives. I don't have the answer for all these questions. We are going to be discussing this with our speakers today. But what I do want to tell you is that we are at the DMD organization. We are working on this for people when they end their life, for that end not to be so painful, more humane, more dignified way of ending our lives. There are so many unnecessary pains that we suffer. So we shall continue working on this the way we've been working on this until now. Thank you so much. This is all I wanted to say. I know many of you are already doing things, but in DMD, this is what we are doing. And this has to do with the possibility of pain, and when it can be unbearable, you can decide to do something else, dignified death, assisted death. This is the point we want to reach. But the first thing is to try to take this pain away from people while we're all here on the face of this earth. This is what I wanted to say, and what, generally speaking, pain is all about. And I'm so happy to have Francis and Margarita with us. So please go ahead, please, both of you. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you. Thank you, Amparo. Yes, I'm Cristina Villarreal. I'm from Colombia. I live in Colombia. I've been working here in Colombia on all these issues. Good afternoon. Good morning in Mexico City and Washington. Well, I'm so glad to be part of this dialogue. What a pleasure to be with you. This one on suffering and pain. For years and years, I've been thinking about this and related to assisted death. Thank you, Amparo, for your very interesting reflections on pain and suffering. For the participants, I want to welcome all of you. How nice having you. This is, as Amparo said, we have two excellent panelists, Francis Kisling and Margarita Araujo. But let me tell you about the dynamic for this dialogue. We have 2 hours for the entire dialogue. Each one of our panelists will have 15 to 20 minutes for their perspective. After that, we will have a Q&A session, a conversation process, and then we will entertain your questions. I thank you for being here. Please ask your questions through the chat mode. You have the icon there. I will try to include all your questions. We've had other dialogues last year with very active participation. And we might not be able to answer your questions. We want to thank Lilia Rubio for her interpretation, simultaneous interpretation that you can listen to. And you have the icon right at the bottom of your screen, Spanish or English. Now then, let's begin after this introductory remarks of Amparo. Francis Kisling, who's the president of the Center for Health Ethics and Social Policy in Washington, D.C. She's been working so much on this issue. She's been actively working for so many years, and she was the founder of Catholics for Choice, and also Católicas por el Derecho a Decidir in Mexico. She's been teaching Harvard and many universities, and also UNAM Institute for the Investigation of Philosophy in Mexico City. And she is a feminist leader. She has been working in Latin America as well as all over the world and in the United States. She's published over 250 articles in different publications, reviews, magazines, and she is now working on these very important issues. We could continue telling you about Francis Kisling, but we want to think about Catholic thinking. Let me tell you, this doesn't mean that there are no other approaches or other ways of spirituality, but I think our countries are mainly Catholic. So this is the type of perspective. Francis, please, you have the floor for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. I'm going to share my screen with you, I hope. Yes, are you seeing my screen? I want to show you some slides. Well, I will try once more. There we go. Okay, let me get these back to the first slide so we are together. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about, first of all, let me say this. The goal of DMD, along with the goal, I presume, of many of you who join us on these webinars, is really to ensure that people have a dignified death. And there are many aspects to what would it mean to have a dignified death and who is entitled to a dignified death. The easiest thing that we talk about, although it is still very difficult and mostly illegal, is the right of those who are terminally ill and in pain to end their lives. There's more acceptance for that than for other reasons. But in reality, there are many, many reasons that people may feel they have completed their life's journey and desire to move on. And they face, all of us face in this arena, a very significant set of opponents to such ability. Some of the strongest opponents to this ability are churches, religious institutions. Catholicism is prominent in those countries where Catholicism is a major religion in efforts to prevent people from being able to legally end their lives. And we're looking at Catholicism today in part because if there's one thing about, there are many things that are good about Catholicism, and one of those things that is good about Catholicism is that it has a well-structured, articulated set of moral principles. If you ask the question why the Catholic Church feels or acts in certain ways, you can usually find an answer. You can usually find multiple answers. So what I'm concerned with today with you is why does the Catholic Church oppose the right or the need for people who wish to end their lives to do so legally and illegally in the most dignified ways possible? Okay. Now, within Catholicism, what we will find as we do this conversation is that there are contradictions. You know, there is a belief that many have that Catholicism is straightforward, it has its rules, there's no deviation, and everybody believes the same thing. Every bishop believes the same thing. It's not quite true. You know, there's a general framework, and then people do specifically have deviations. One of the contradictions in Catholicism around death and dying is a very important principle, which is to alleviate suffering. The church would say our goal is to alleviate suffering. We work with the poor to alleviate their suffering. Our mission with sick people is compassionate. Most people see Mother Teresa as a saint who really alleviated the suffering of the people she served. At the same time, the church does not, well, the church has another teaching and a rule, which is that our lives do not belong to us. Our lives belong to God. And only God gets to decide when our life will end. And so those principles are automatically in contradiction. I don't actually use my slides. So some of this, and within Christianity, the reason for this idea, what I'm going to explore is how suffering enters into this thought process. The central leader of Christianity is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ allowed himself to be killed in order to save the rest of us, to redeem us of our nature. Jesus Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, as some of you know, asked God, said, "Oh God, take this burden of dying away from me." Even he understood that there was conflict in this mission that he had undertaken. And so this vision of Christ crucified for us is a constant religious symbol. Every church you go into has a cross. It doesn't just have a cross, it has a cross with Jesus on the cross. So that is a central part of this narrative. And what this narrative then results in is the idea that suffering is a good thing. We suffer because it brings us redemption and ultimately happiness in heaven. That is it. One of the great examples of suffering we are well aware of in the modern time was Pope John Paul II, a very famous pope, and yet probably the first thing you think about him when you hear his name is how he suffered from his illnesses in the last year of his life. He made himself an example of the acceptance of suffering. And this kind of thinking, again, is part and parcel of what we are dealing with in this situation. Just as John Paul emulated Christ, the church says to us, or to people, our job is to be Christ-like. Christ accepted suffering. In some of Amparo's remarks, she brought up some of these things. Is suffering good? What would life be without suffering? And we know the things that we hear, the things that people are told and that we tell ourselves. God would not send us more suffering than we can tolerate. God loves us and sends us suffering. In the secular realm, we even hear suffering is essential to creativity. The person who has not suffered cannot really be a good artist. All right. Church leaders from time immemorial remind us of Christ on the cross. St. Paul, the apostle, said, we share in the cross of Jesus. But I think we need to question some of this emphasis on suffering, right? Is suffering good? If we could not suffer, would that not be better? Do we reduce the human being, particularly the suffering human being, to only one thing, the value of their suffering, and the rest of their life disappears? Going down to the next slide, yes. I've already said this. We've talked about the fact that the church presents suffering as salvific. It contributes to our salvation and the salvation of the world. And I've mentioned some of these things. Suffering brings out certain values, often values that lead to passivity, acceptance. We are to accept. We are to be hopeful. We are to surrender. All of these aspects are things that we have been told make suffering valuable. Of course, one of the reasons that we do that is because suffering is inevitable. And so instead of fighting against suffering, we say, well, suffering has this good thing. You will be rewarded in heaven for the suffering you experience on earth. And there's a political dimension to this because the people who suffer the most are poor people. And we're often not prepared, including the church, to take care of poor people. But there's another counterpoint to this. I'm trying to keep to time here. There's another aspect of the church we need to look at. It's appreciation and honoring of suffering as good. And it's, on the other end, disrespect for and fear of pleasure. These things, if you're not going to suffer, you might be having pleasure. And we're not so sure that pleasure is a good thing. And this is rooted in Christianity. And the way it is rooted in Christianity goes back to the early Christians. Early Christians believed that Christ was coming fast. They thought he would come back and take them all to heaven within their own lifetimes. And so they understood their purpose to be to spend their time thinking about God and waiting for God to come. Now, they were human beings, and they had desires and urges. And they understood, for example, sexuality to be one of the strongest desires Christians had. People had. But that desire and acting on that desire took us away from God. All right. So this rootedness in the experience of pleasure as bad and suffering as good is in part at the root of today's church leaders who say, no, you cannot end your life. Pain is the price of pleasure, is the last component. And the most obvious example of this is what was said by God to Eve as she left paradise. I will sharpen the pain of your pregnancy, and in pain you will give birth. And you will desire to control your husband, but that's not going to happen. Okay. So what we have in this, again, is the added component. Suffering, love, distaste for pleasure, and a desire to punish. These three elements influence strongly how the church thinks about this. I need to move on quickly now. Some of these slides you will have available to you. I'm interested in this talk in what we call existential suffering. There's physical pain. Physical pain can lead to suffering. And then there are people who have no physical pain whatsoever, but have deep suffering. Okay. The common themes in existential suffering are the lack of meaning or purpose you feel, the loss of connectedness to each other, thoughts about the dying process, struggles around the state of being, who are you, and difficulty in finding a sense of self. These experiences are, as we know, existential philosophy, but these are existential human experiences. And there are people for whom these experiences are so difficult that they really do not any longer wish to live. There are also a few people who simply feel they have lived their lives. They've had a decent life, and the time has come. And that is the question. Do we get to decide when the time comes? Now, I'm going to quickly run through some of the present positions of the Catholic Church around euthanasia, assisted suicide, etc., because there is some confusion about this. The position of the Catholic Church has, for most of history, been absolute prohibition on the taking of your life, and certainly on anyone helping you do that. This is still the position, but there are small changes that are happening that we do not recognize. Some of those, the hard line is here. Whatever its motives or means, direct euthanasia consists in putting an end to the lives of handicapped, sick, dying persons. Morally unacceptable. Hard line. And then a little bit of compassion has come in recent years. For example, you would never have been able in a hospital to discontinue any medical procedures 50 years ago, 20 years ago. But now, the Catholic Catechism says discontinuing medical procedures that are burdensome, dangerous, extraordinary, blah, 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 is permitted. We should not overzealously treat those who are along the path to die. So that has taken some very interesting forms in addition. This slide is a slide of a Catholic cemetery, and it's an important one. When I was growing up, if you committed suicide, you did not get a funeral mass. This was not permitted. You did not get buried in the same Catholic cemetery with your family. You were buried outside of the cemetery. Now the church has changed. If you commit suicide, you can have a Catholic burial. You can be buried with your family. In part, this is compassion. In part, the other reason is that theology has advanced to the point where we understand. Oh, what happened? I lost my slideshow. Okay, well, all right. I actually don't need it anymore. I can just say what I have to say. All right. The church now understands that it cannot judge the state of your conscience. It does not know why you committed suicide. It does not know if you were healthy in mind when you committed suicide. We leave those decisions to God. And therefore, we are prepared to treat the person who dies as a full human being. The final point I'm going to make is the point about, can you be, I'm sure you believe, many of you believe, and I'm sure that the bishops will say this, you can't be a Catholic, a good Catholic, and believe in suicide. You can't be a good Catholic and work to change the laws on suicide. You can't be a good Catholic and work to change the laws on suicide, assisted suicide, and euthanasia. These are things you cannot do. Well, the fact of the matter is that you can be those things, and that there are reasons in canon law and in church teaching that permit you to do that. The first thing is the Catholic principle of conscience. Catholics are obliged to follow their conscience, even if their conscience disagrees with the teaching of the church. In fact, the primacy of conscience is so deeply embedded in the church that even if you are threatened with excommunication for following your conscience, you are supposed to follow your conscience. That's the first thing. The second thing is, around the time of the Second Vatican Council, there were a number of important proclamations. One proclamation was called the Declaration on Religious Liberty. This declaration said, we Catholics don't want to be discriminated upon in law because we are Catholics. And we should not favor laws that would limit the religious freedom of others to act in accordance with the beliefs of their religion. Not all religions are adamantly opposed to suicide, etc. I mean, all of us would like it. Well, maybe this is a bad thing. In general, we try to be sure that people who choose to take their life have made a careful decision. Because, it's kind of permanent. None of us are being resurrected in this time. So, respect for religious liberty also causes respect for the right to decide on what kind of death you want to experience. I could give you some more reasons. There are some of them on my slides. I think the slides will go up at some point. But those are some of the core things I would like us to think about. Is suffering good? In and of itself good. Good things can come of it, but is suffering something to seek? When you graduate from university and you say, these are some things I want to happen in my life. Do you say, and I really hope I get a fair share of suffering before I die? How do we think about suffering? How do we think about the history of Catholic thought in terms of the reasons it opposes euthanasia, assisted suicide, and suicide? What do you think the proper balance is between the rules and compassion? what are the most important principles of a religious nature that should be kept in mind when a person is in grave physical pain, at the point of terminal illness, or with such great existential suffering that continuing their life is not what they want to do. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Frances. Muchas gracias por este contexto que sin duda...
Thank you, Frances, for this excellent context. Thank you so much. We can understand now with this exaltation of those types of principles or values or ways of thinking, we understand where this comes from, this religious position and this personal decision about ending one's life. Thank you, Shirley. All your observations imply many questions, and people are asking questions, and people are writing their questions. Let us continue with Dr. Margarita Araujo Navarrete, a medical specialist on palliative care. Margarita, as I've said, she graduated at the National University of Mexico, and she specializes on palliative care in many other practices. She's done clinical work for years. Right now, she coordinates the specialized clinic for the Cancer Center in the ABC Hospital in Mexico City. And she works with other hospitals and institutions. She chairs the hospital committee of the ABC Hospital on ethics. She was with us in the first dialogue we had last year on palliative care. Today, she will be sharing with us her experience of so many years on palliative care, physical pain, and emotional suffering. Welcome, Margarita. Please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so grateful for being here with you. Frances, Amparo, and Cristina, thank you. And Lilia, who's also translating. Well, can you see my screen? Yes, you can. Okay. And you can hear me, right? Okay, no. Now, the first thing I wanted to tell you is that discussing this type of issues, as the two speakers have already mentioned, this is a universe, really. And going into understanding suffering and pain implies going into the universe of a person, the internal universe of the human being. We share the external universe, but we each have our way of seeing things, our own world. We each have our own history and stories. Let me tell you about this. This is the support that it's allowing us to respond in the face of crisis, suffering, pain, and losses, for instance. But there are so many situations. This pandemic of COVID-19 is exposing us to understanding that we are responding to crisis, each one of us according to our own history and story. And the family, of course, but health, we don't grant it the right importance because WHO is talking about a balanced biological, physical, and emotional state. So full health, it is difficult for us to have that. And the truth is that there's extraordinary democracy, the rich, the poor, the short, the tall, intelligent, or the dumb. Everyone is subject to losing health. And thus, everyone has to respond to a complex situation. Of course, the spiritual part, as already said, is very transcendental in all this. Catholicism, that could be through Catholicism or any other way in which people address spirituality. And this is their support, their context of support. at the professional and educational level. I think those two aspects are very important because sometimes we say, well, the patient has gone to school, he has the schooling level, but it doesn't really matter if they're very important people or very smart people or people that are illiterate. Being a professional and doing something, well, whatever, under situations of people who are doing very simple things, shining shoes out in the street or cooking food or being a very important businessman. It really depends on their taste, how professional, how much education do they have, what is the satisfaction they can get through the context in which they live and the way they serve others. This makes a big difference. There are people who don't understand what is happening. They don't want to understand it because then those experiences may be positive or negative, particularly losing your health. Right now, we are facing so many problems. They should be of great benefit because we're getting so much information. However, there's also so much misinformation or lack of information and things we think we understand, but we don't really understand. So this is all part of a human being, a person, and the person has the facility of responding. But sometimes the clinical history is not enough, and the questionnaire is not enough. We have to understand the person's universe to understand that risks and threats that the person is facing because of suffering, losses, or pain, or any other crisis the person is going through, is leading this person to do certain things. People suspect something might happen, or there's certain something is going to happen. So frustration is generated, and the person becomes very vulnerable. This results in a threat, some type of threat. When someone believes he can be diabetic because his siblings or his parents were diabetic or are diabetic and he has some symptoms, with COVID, you start coughing or something and you think, well, I have the virus. So those threats are also affecting us and they are taking certainty away from us. And certainty is a protection. We cannot be secure, we cannot know what is going on. So we are threatened. Our personal roles would disappear, the family, the social roles would disappear. If we have a disease, we have rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, epilepsy, so many illnesses limiting people, and their roles are altered because of those illnesses. And many times, culture and the economy, as someone just said before me, well, sometimes I'm not so sure that if I have money, I am going to solve my illness or my suffering. Sometimes things become even more complicated and suffering is prolonged because of money. Because oncological diseases, people used to die sooner. And it's terrible for me to say this, but they become chronic diseases. And in the best of cases, then people feel healthy and controlled in their illness, but sometimes it's a chronic disease and suffering is prolonged and the situation is prolonged as well. And things become very complicated, one complication after the other, one surgery after the other, and there are possibilities to continue being alive, but it's impossible. And you shouldn't be alive because this suffering is hitting the person so much, damaging the person, and the person doesn't have a life and no future because the patient loses the sense of his own life. So alternatives we have, I'm going to summarize this, and then I will break this down a little bit. We do have alternatives for pain. Yes, of course, the one pain is not the same as the other one. People can exercise so much and people continue exercises and they're happy, but they're hurting anyway, their muscles and everything, they hurt. But those are manageable pains. But there is pain that is really torture, and you're kidnapped in your own body, you're sequestered in your own body because people cannot really live that way with so much pain. So alternatives we have is to plan in advance what is going to happen. Is something we can do now because we know the natural history of illnesses and diseases, and we can intervene to assess, to hold a dialogue with the patient, to deliberate, on what the patient is willing to do within all this context and circumstances, and how the person is going to continue his or her life. And we can reassess continuously. The group of experts can continue this assessment, presenting options and defining objectives for the person to know whether they want to take those options. This can be done on an everyday basis, daily routine. We all know we are going to die, but the others won't die. So each day has its own value, and we can really take advantage of that value. You don't have to be sick to die. You don't have to 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 die to suffer. For some people, they live in a soap opera. They enjoy suffering. Sometimes you wonder how is it possible for this person to be going through that. But this has to do with personal history, and people have a way of responding to their own needs and circumstances. We always have to respect autonomy, and we want to understand the person so that according to their family role, the professional roles, and their own economic situation, according to their social situation, we can with full respect to what the person is feeling, we can give some sense to our life with respect, because regardless of what we think, each one of us thinks, hope is something that will be sustaining us, and hopelessness is sinking us, and we have a lot of uncertainty when we have no hope. So many people say, I'm anxious, I'm depressed, and this is a true delirium, insomnia. And then this can generate very terrible definitive thoughts that sometimes are not so real. So we have to understand the patient. We have to help the patient to be as clear as possible, not telling him not because you're going through this delirium or depression, you haven't slept, and this is a terrible situation you're in, then people start thinking grave things. So we have to respect the person's autonomy, even in the circumstances, give the person hope so that their everyday life is really worth living. There are so many symptoms. I'm just mentioning a few symptoms of many, many things that generate malaise, and each has its own treatment protocol to be controlled. Uh, Specific pain, as Amparo was saying, well, does it have any value? It seems that it does, because people learn to understand the value of health through pain. And we haven't really been able to understand how valuable health is. We have everything with health, nothing without health. No one was prepared in the world to understand what is happening with this pandemic right now. No one was prepared for that. So, preoccupations of patients, their own concerns. Sometimes there are situations that will never really take place, but they've been reading about it, and this is the best example. We're all have panic. We want to get the vaccination, but these are situations that are not necessarily going to happen if we protect ourselves through other means for now. But this is almost half of the concern we have. There are other concerns. People say, well, I had this, I used to do that, I used to do this. So these things are of great concern to us, just imagining things. So this is 70% of our concerns. Just letting patients tell us about their concerns, we start solving things just by letting them talk. And their useful thoughts, useless rather, useless thoughts. We're thinking, what if this? What if I got COVID-19? Then I will stop breathing. I have to buy a ventilator immediately, a respirator in case I get COVID. So we have the social and political issues that are part of this. Epidemiological studies tell us, how we should be looking for solutions. Those thoughts are useless because we're just blocking ourselves and our own minds, thinking that we're solving things that are not even happening to us, or very small things that all of a sudden become big, big things because we start thinking about them. And people have a little bit of fever and they think, okay, this is going to lead to death and suffering and pain. Well, the true risks we are facing, it's only 8% of all the anxiety we feel. Only 8%. That is, there is suffering people feel, and there's real suffering. And the real suffering can be solved most of the time. If they cannot be solved, then death may also be one of the best friends. In a very personal manner, I say death really loves us. It gives us life. It takes care of us. And when we get sick, we start thinking, well, this is the end. And death tells us, this is not your end. And finally, when you say it's over, when we're freed from all problems. And this is good because everyone starts saying good things about those that have died. It was the best person I've ever met, someone says. Well, what about the palliative care? This doctor talks about urgent symptoms and important symptoms. Sometimes they're very different. Urgency for bleeding, hemorrhage, and things like that, especially when patients are in depression, when they're depressed, thinking about suicide, suffering becomes very complicated in those cases. But generally, most of the symptoms, they can all be solved. They're all urgent. Others are not so urgent. They're not very nice to have. And fatigue, tiredness. One believes that eating a lot is bad, but not eating enough is also bad. And there are others where social function, when you stop working, you stop generating economic changes in your society, and the spiritual situation, where am I going? What do I believe in? Those are also important questions. The urgency is not so much, but the importance is higher. And the interesting thing is that we don't have to lose sight of all this set of situations we have to deal with when we talk to a patient. Now, dignity and the sense of life, well being, and welfare that generate happiness, well, that's the sense we have every day in our daily lives. And this is something we have to take the bad aspects from. These are very abstract and complex things. They are anthropological, sociological, philosophical, theological studies that have to do also with politics. This means that speaking about dignity and autonomy is just so important in situations of suffering because something which is linked, closely linked, is what do we want to be as persons. Dignity is valuable. It refers to this inherent value of human beings. It has no cost. There's no cost to it. It has to do with freedom, rationality, creating power or creative power. What can we really do to be happy and to be useful? These are situations that when we lose them, who wants to live that way? I mean, even in limit or borderline situations, when relatives say, well, I don't know what to do. I just met the patient, but you have been with this patient all your life. Do you want him to continue with this type of life? This life with the infected tumor, horrible things that no one has to go through or live through. So, freedom may be explained through autonomy of human beings. So, this condition of independence to be ourselves, I believe, is what we should be more cautious about with patients, really protected. And the truth of the disease, we have the truth in our hands with the studies and the exams, and we even come out and say it. And sometimes the patients don't want to hear it. However, it has to do with dignity. Therefore, things become very complicated. They're angry, they're in denial, they're very sad. And for true acceptance, well, that's the only way we can solve things when we know the truth. So, those experiences of the patients, we have to help them understand what they're going through. Who would have to solve these things? And this is the drawing here, the drawing that I have here. This is what a human being is all about. We really have to understand this is the universe I'm talking about. I think just as we see the planets and their own rhythm, their own pace, moving in the universe, I would like to think that each planet is each one of us. And who do we have to help? Who do we have to help in their experiences? The medical services, the nurses, the psychologists, the social workers, therapists, psychotherapy, and caregivers and support teams. Yes, it's always good to understand. But we have families of 2 people or 12 people. Some family members want one thing and the others want something else. One says, let's take him to the hospital. The other one says, no, let us not take him to the hospital. So what we have to do, all this group of professionals, we have to try to make the family understand. We want the patient to be in good shape. I mean, we all want the same, but we all each want it in a different manner. So this situation, some are different from others, but we have to surround the patient, protect the patient, thinking that the protagonist is the patient himself or herself. What are we gaining through all this? Well, to improve the quality of life of the patient, to start with, respecting autonomy, when we let the patients decide, even, well, with a very sensitive way of informing the patient about the bad things that are happening to the patient, then the patients can start deciding where and how they want to die. This is not easy task, but this is something we can do, and I think that has to do with culture, and culture is changing, so that we can know, for instance, well, this is really terrible. The patients, the COVID-19 patients, are isolated; they die alone, and we should reflect on this. What is it that we want? And this makes us have some type of control over our own decisions. And of course, it is painful, but it is less painful for families when they have certain control and people don't feel guilty that they should have done this or they should have done that for their patient. And for us, we feel satisfied because we're guaranteeing better care for the patient. And this work is difficult, but there's something even worse. Not doing this work is even worse than doing it. Then this X-ray, this you see this X-ray where the tumor was, and the bone marrow is punctured. A patient with cancer that had not been detected. First symptom, back pain, terrible back pain. So we did neurosurgical treatment for this patient. People say, well, because the patient had the money for that, or they never should have had the surgery on this patient. Well, she would have been paralyzed anyway, and paraplegic, and with this type of lesion. But if she was going to live 3 months, she lived 4 more months with a lot of suffering, not pain. The pain was controlled. But the problem was that she suffered because she knew she was going to die. And she still had projects that we started working on with her. And she accepted. And the surgery allowed her to have those 4 months. And of course, there are patients who have this type of situation. They can have no surgery, sometimes because they don't have the money for it. There's no one to be caring for them this 4 months. Well, the dramatic thing is for people to understand that the person died not because the person didn't have any money. The person died because the person had a grave illness, and the person would suffer anyway, and even a prolonged survival. And it's very difficult to understand. And the other pictures of a woman, her illness was controlled, but you see her legs and the complications, one after the other complication. She said, I do not want another complication, she said.
Right.
I have taken everything I can take, but I cannot take anymore. So this allows us to understand that they're very antagonic answers or responses. There are people who are committed to continue living with suffering. I have very close patients because this is our patients that I work with. She told me once, one more day seeing my children is worth everything. Just one more day of being with my children is worth my suffering. That's what she said, and that's the way she saw it. And other patients have told me, yes, the treatment isn't curing me of anything, and others are in the extreme. They say, I have the right over my life and my death, and I cannot bear this anymore. I don't want to be here anymore. This is a dilemma that we have to also understand and listen to. Is not that the patient will let us just put the switch down. This is a conflict of values. We have to grant importance to freedom, dignity, and human life. We also have to work with the family. We have to see what resources and competences we have to see how much we can prolong this condition until the end or not. And this is part of what is being allowed in Mexico. It is legal. This is a struggle of many years, but we've been able to have intermittent sedation. Patients who cannot sleep, you can sedate them lightly, slightly, so that they can sleep a little and then they can wake up and can think differently. So the palliative care for symptoms that are not manageable anymore, refractory, they have resist any other possibility to be cured. So this is also allowed in these cases. So when do we have to make decisions? Well, initial consults, we have to start assessing the patient. We have to look into specific treatments, support treatment for certain disease, and of course, controlling symptoms. And there are values here that cannot be transferred, intransferable values. And for instance, veracity, respecting confidentiality, and really care for everything we can care for. I don't know if I showed you this. I arrived in someone's home and pulmonary fibrosis. That's what the patient had. She didn't understand anything about anticipated will, or she put it on the wall. This is what she wrote. You can see it, just the masking tape, whatever she found. No hospitalization, no glucose, no cortisone, no epinephrine, and no strong injections or shots, no nebulization, no resuscitation, no steroids, no steroids. That's what she wrote herself, and she put it on the wall. Well, I really feel very emotional when I remember this woman's case. She didn't live a lot longer. She was in the terminal stage, terminal illness, and the son respected her will. And we had no problems. It's good for people to have this anticipated will. This is very good because this helps us to understand we did the right thing. And there might always be someone said, you decided for the patient. You were abusing your power over the patient. And no, these are families with many children. And some say yes, others say no to what would happen to their patient. But this is the only way we can solve. What does the patient want? This was on Facebook. You can see it right here. Where do we want to die? In a hospital, intubated, or at home with our loved ones? So over 200,000 families who have lost their relatives because of COVID. I think they see this in a very different manner because they had lost a loved one as in this pandemic. There are etiological, symptomatic treatment, and vital support treatment. How far are we ready to go? The patient wants to leave this world, but we don't let the patient. So this is what's happening. Families have told me, God will decide. And I said, God has decided, you just don't let him. So anticipated will is not only a document. It has to be someone solidary to make this document valid, to validate the document. And in this, of course, the decision of the patient, the daughter may say, well, I don't know what to decide. Well, she doesn't know. This is a conflict. We have to help the patient. We have to give them enough information to respect that decision of the patient. We have to inform the relatives. And if the treatment is rejected, this has to go through a consent agreement. And to conclude, well, there are many ways of doing this, but closeness, communication are important. Understanding, compassion is not just saying, I'm going to turn the switch off. We have to understand what the person, the patient, the relatives are going through. It's not just holding the person's hand. We have to try to understand what they're really feeling. This is the most important thing. We are losing a life. But if I can have a happy life and a good life, that's fine. But people that feel that life owes everything to them and they have nothing to do in life and just pain being generated and suffering as well. Now, in terms of palliative sedation, it's legal in Mexico whenever we have a justification. Unlike euthanasia, well, there's an intention in palliative sedation. There's a process and a result. So the intention will always be liberating the person from suffering. But how? Taking problems away or taking the person away. And then, um medication, doses also is a poison. How much doses? What is the dosage? And the reducing conscience, alleviating suffering and other symptoms or related symptoms. Can we really solve those symptoms? If we cannot, well, death is imminent and there's suffering. What is the difference between a few more hours or less hours? Because this medication, it seems that we send the person the other side. And this is a euphemism. It really depends on the situation, I believe. So then there are definitions and classifications we have to forget about. Active, passive, voluntary, or direct. Euthanasia, if it's not voluntary, well, it's murder, right? But we do have a possibility of limiting suffering, limiting treatment that will not do anything for the patient, and giving people medicine when you can control pain. Well, maybe. Will that mean death for the person? Difficult to confirm that. Some are choking and then they start breathing because they're less anxious. All of a sudden, this happens. So, this is a different possibility, different from cutting people's life. And sometimes this is a reality. And when we find the patient unconscious in agony and no oxygen saturation, well, this has to be some guidance for us. It should be telling us something. And suffering, people who cannot suffer anymore, period. What about suicidal people? It's very difficult to take people away from the situation after having decided to commit suicide because people who try to commit suicide and they don't are dying many times. They prepare so many things. Whenever they think about suicide, they're dying a little bit. So they have many deaths when they try to commit suicide and they don't make it. Well, these are things we have to try to understand, to comprehend, and try to resolve, address, to have a less hurting society, a culture for people to understand that compassion is a form of love. And I think it's marvelous to look at it this way to avoid suffering, which is very different from acute pain, Amparo, in which pain can be treated and the cause causing pain disappears. That's what they say. Yes, you can take pain away. Yes, because you take the cause away. But when this cause persists and remains and prevails and it's destroying everything, it's invading everything, other measures are necessary. We should, like this howling person screaming blocks away, you could hear that. What is the redemption then? I hope I didn't take more than my time. Thank you so much. Your experience is really telling us, illustrating what happens with bone and flesh people, as we say in Spanish. And yes, we are going to go directly to the Q&A session. We barely have time for that. There are many interesting questions, many and all very interesting. We want our participants to also take the floor. So let's do it this way. Just a clarification here. I think you've all insinuated who is called to define if suffering is such that life makes no sense. Is it the doctor who defines that or decides that? Who is called to do that? Is it the person who is suffering, who is going through acute pain? Who decides? This is for all of you. I think this is a very important thing for us to clarify. Who defines that moment? If you allow me, I think it's a person. Because, look, the person knows that they know they have to go to a professional. But the relative says, a nurse. There's no place for us to have a nurse here, the relatives say. But if the patient says, I do need a nurse, that's the important thing. When the patient says, I can stand up and go to the bathroom, yes, but you might fall down and break something. So we have to participate in those definitions. For the family, it is very difficult to make that decision. I think that the doctor should be looking for ways in which the patient can say that for himself independently. But those of us with the experience of complications that might arise is the health team. Maybe kind of directing things in such a manner for acceptance to take place on the side of the patient and the relatives, and looking into different possibilities for the family to accept the decision. Amparo. Yes. Yes, thank you. I had an experience I wanted to share with you. A person in Cuba, a woman in Cuba.
Ya llevaba tiempo y las hermanas, tenía
She
hermanas.
was resurrected. The sisters had to decide.
Son mucho más que yo.
And you know how difficult this is. They didn't know what to do. They were very conscious of everything that was happening. So the sisters said, what do we do?
Ese papelito.
She didn't write anything. They didn't know what to do with her. Your microphone, please, Amparo. Yes. The patient hadn't written anything. And the sisters found it very difficult. Remember, we didn't love her so much. Our parents preferred her over because she had a disability. What if we're making this decision of withdrawing the treatment because she's not going to recover? So the relatives were thinking about this in a very serious manner, and they wanted to decide because they were worried about her dignity. They thought about it so much. Well, finally, she woke up all of a sudden, and she lived many years after that. I love this story. This is a true life story. You see the conscience of the family, the sisters who were thinking what to do. She's going through this coma. And they said, all we want is the best decision with compassion in a very loving manner. When there's a will and people say exactly, and person is there and the family has to decide. But this was the right family for this person going through this coma. And I think it has to do with what we said. And I really liked because the patient may decide sometimes, but sometimes, like in this case, the patient cannot decide it. It's only the relatives, the sisters, the siblings that have to decide, thinking about their patient. Yes, it's very comforting to hear about suffering. Does it make any sense to suffer, or when does it stop making sense? But this doesn't happen in all countries because we don't have legislative progress being made in this regard in some countries. We have another question. Francisco Valdovinos, what is the difference veneration of suffering with masochism, which is a pathological? What is the difference?
Right. Well, I mean, I think to some extent the difference is action. That's one area in which we would say committing the act of causing suffering or of seeking suffering in masochistic ways is one thing. Having a mental disposition to seeing suffering as a positive value for something else is the other. So I think that's the difference. I don't think, for example, that the Pope, who thinks suffering is salutary, is good, is a masochist. He might be, but he might not be. Probably is not.
Ok, hemos hablado, y ustedes todas tal vez han hablado, de dolor físico y de dolor.
Yes, this has to do with physical, emotional pain. Emotional pain, does it imply suffering? Second, Fatima's asking, is there any common denominator between physical pain and emotional pain? For any of you, please. The truth is that physical pain is studied even more than in the past. There were many efforts already, but in the last 30 years, marvelous time for us to understand the biological aspect, the neurological, psychological aspect. And this is being studied, and physical pain is very explainable right now. It does have situations that might not be so clear, but we now clearly understand, because there was a time when neuropathic pain was, the people were crazy and they were sent to one of those hospitals for them and they were confined. But there are new protocols now, and so much research is being done with different classifications. Last year, there was a reorganization of the definition of pain by the National Association for the Study of Pain, and they took a phrase away saying it is a sensation, an individual disagreeable sensation. But they said, according to what the patient expresses, according to what the patient says. And this phrase has been taken away because there are people who cannot express what they feel. People that are deaf and dumb and they cannot express. And people just can't express it even though they can talk. So other human beings that have pain and they cannot express. Animals and even plants perhaps. So there we could establish a difference. Emotions, we are that incredible universe. The Yohari window, the 4 squares, you see yourself. In another one, you see how others see you. And then the other one, reality of others see. And the one is just dark, a dark square. And things happen, then you never thought you would be reacting that way. And you do react that way. You never thought of it. So in this crisis of uncertainty, not knowing what will happen, and lack of the necessary knowledge, or just hearing other people say what is going to happen. People make decisions because they're terribly scared of the disease more than of what they really feel of physical pain. They think, where am I going to with this pain? Where will I be arriving with this pain? So the social aspect is also important. That's why it's sometimes so difficult to treat pain. The only measurement I have is what the patient tells me. And sometimes it's the suffering and not the physical, emotional part. It's important to understand this universe, to understand the physical area, to find a solution according to each patient. Francis and Amparo, anything you want to add on physical pain, emotional pain?
I think Margarita has expressed it well. I think that the only thing I would add is that the causes of suffering are, for the most part, different than the causes of pain. We don't distinguish these words well, but physical pain has a physical cause, and as Margarita says, we actually know quite a bit about those physical causes. Now, physical pain can result in emotional suffering. I think we recognize that. Those are two different. Both are bad, but they exist.
Sí. De hecho, se dice en la medicina
Yes.
se dice que
Yes, in fact, physical pain is an ally. Signs of alarm. But Margarita, pain, it's an ally of the doctor, or is it the enemy of the patient? There's a difference between acute and chronic disease. Acute pain is guiding you, it guides you, and how far you can go to solve it. It's like a guideline. If you solve it, that's the end of that. But chronic disease, sometimes it becomes a torturer, an enemy, no benefit whatsoever. It increases and it really crushes people. It's like a dragon with fire, and then it scratches you, it attacks you. It's something grave with no benefit. Chronic disease, that's what we have to try to control. The other one has been highly studied, and there's a path to solve it. Yes. We have Alberto Jesus Flores. What is the point of no return when there's nothing that can be done? Suffering will never stop. This is what you're saying. Someone is asking, is there any condition where there's no pain? No partial disease, but no pain whatsoever. Does it ever exist? A painless state? Yes, if there's no pain, as Amparo was asking, and this person as well, then we would get burned and we would be cutting ourselves as children. But pain is a limitation, it limits us. We think of pain when we see the car coming and we're about to cross the street. It is a defense mechanism we have. There's no way pain cannot exist. It's part of our lives. But in the tribes, or even before the tribes, yes, someone had pain. What did the person next to this painful person do? They had to look for a solution, even before the tribes existed. And I say this jokingly, but we have to do everything possible to help. They were using these cataplasms. Well, now this type of very primitive medicine has to do with staying in the hospital and intensive care unit for 2 months. And specialists have to speak out and understanding that the protagonist is the patient. We don't want to be giving ourselves medals. We want the patient to be there. We want to help the person because we care about the person's well-being. Margarita, in your presentation, spoke about alternatives. How can we help people? How can we start with early discussions on those issues through the consultation process and the relatives as well? Amparo, at DMD, would you like to tell us how you can help people with their suffering and pain? How do we approach people, even though we do not know how much pain they're going through? Your microphone, please.
En ese tema hemos estado
I
trabajando.
think this is something we've been working on with Francis and myself. What programs we can organize at DMD to try to collaborate? There are many people asking us that question. Perhaps in the near future, we will be announcing the project Francis and I are working on so that we can offer it on behalf of DMD. There are people who have spontaneous type of response, but I think that for most of the people, guidelines are necessary, a context helping us to be aware of these things, because I think that to start with, we don't like to talk about death. Yes, and this is something that we know will happen. People didn't want to hear the patient howling, for instance. People would start fleeing, getting away from the person suffering. We're getting so many testimonies from relatives abandoning their own family members. And the grandmother, no one wanted to be close to her. She was there alone, suffering. They could not stay there with her. Not even the daughter of this lady would be there with her. And she died, the grandmother, in complete solitude. We have to learn to see death face to face. And it's part of life. What can we do with the care we give? Well, I think other people's deaths may even be better because you accompany the person in the acceptance process. In this program, we are discussing so that we can launch it through DMD. I think this is a very necessary program. In DMD, you are doing this work to understand this is not only something you should talk about with a limited number of people, but this is something you should be discussing. Francis,
Yeah.
someone is saying something here. Let me see. It is a question for you, Francis. Science and religion complement each other. They are like judges, right? Science and religion.
Well, no, they don't accompany each other. They both are valuable, but I think that we cannot. This is like what we say in English: a round peg trying to stick a round toy in a square box. Okay, that these are both valuable aspects of knowledge, value, being, etc. But religion has, first of all, religion should be influenced by facts. Facts are helpful. Science is helpful. But religion, for better and worse, has a set of principles a set of values where sometimes facts are not really what is important to the religious person. So where they can combine, good, but they each have their own sphere. And each of us as people are oriented in our own ways more towards one or the other. Some people are only interested in facts. Nothing wrong with that. Some people are not terribly interested in facts. They're interested in values, ethics, ideas, etc. They can complement each other, but they are not the same.
Muchas gracias.
Yeah.
Muy importante aclaración.
Very important clarification. Thank you, Francis. Yes, Margarita, someone is asking on percentages you were showing on patients' preoccupations and concerns. What source are you using for those percentages? Well, this is something that I read, and I have to find. I didn't have time, but I will find the source, the reference. Please write me. I will look for the reference. This is a survey. I lost the reference, but I do have it. Please write me, and I promise you that I will find it because they're very interesting figures, yes. Please write me, and I will give you this information. Thank you very much. I think, well, I do have a question for Margarita, but if any of the other two speakers want to participate, please. Amparo spoke about the politics of suffering, experiencing pain and suffering is different for a person that has money and a person that doesn't have money. And this is true. This is a valuable analysis. I wonder if in our cultures, women, are we the caregivers? It's usually us who are caring for others. So we women live suffering in a different manner. Are we more than willing to tolerate our own suffering and other people's suffering? Is because we care for people? We are caregivers. The reality of things is that studies have been done, and not necessarily. The truth of the matter is that there's been education in many cultures. I don't know if this is a universal thing, but men are told, don't cry, you're a man. You can do this, you can do that. Don't cry. So, yes, they feel, but they don't express their feelings. Unfortunately, there are feelings that are inhibited. That's why they don't show those feelings, because there's a difficulty expressing those feelings. It's more difficult for men. But generally speaking, from the biological viewpoint, well, we all suffer pain. We are wireless. All our cables are perfectly well organized within us to feel things. And we are the same, men and women. And you feel pain the same way. Newborn, the fetus, may have sensations at some point, nice or not very nice sensations. And we are understanding this better. But adults, physically, some may be stronger than others. And some may be more tolerant than other adults. The threshold is something we talk about. And I think this is a situation of education. Families, if you fall off the bike, they say just get up and continue. And or they carry you and take you to the psychologist so that you're not traumatized because you fell off your bike. So you become like a crystal person. Men and women feel the same thing. The difference is how you express what you feel. And in one gender or the other, the same. A woman who lives in a rural community does not give birth to a child the same way as someone who is taking classes how to breathe, and she lives in an urban center. So surely the pain those two women will have in childbearing will be different. So there are many things that are intervening in this situation. Yes. Francis, any final remarks
I'll
from
comment
you?
on what Margarita said. I do an exercise in workshops that I give, in which I say the following to the men in my workshops. I say, now you have heard that giving birth is one of the most beautiful experiences in the world. Okay. Women are smiling, and that it is a joy to bring new life into the world. So, given that understanding, how many of you men would like to have this experience of pregnancy? You want to be pregnant and birth a baby? Raise your hand. I have done this with hundreds, probably more than 1,000 people. In all that time, only 2 men have ever raised their hand. And the others are very practical. They're more practical. Well, they all say, no, it hurts. And I say, we promise we will find a place for the baby to come out that is not your penis. Okay. We know they wouldn't want the baby to come out of their penis. It's so little. Never mind our vaginas. So we're going to find a place for this. But no, it's absolutely too painful. They will not do this, number one. Number two, they say, I'm busy. I don't have 9 months to give to having a baby inside of me. It hurts. It hurts, etc. So they have many, many reasons that they do not want this, both in terms of pain, etc. We would probably have many fewer babies if God had made men the ones who got pregnant.
Totalmente de acuerdo. Bueno, yo creo que el tiempo se nos está agotando. Para mí es, como conclusión de todo este webinario, es completamente...
Thank you so much. Yes, it's quite evident that it's in suffering and not so much, not physical pain, where the decision is based of anticipating death for people. That's why we renew this invitation for these issues to be discussed in all spaces, and for us to understand what is really happening with pain and ending life. Amparo, could you please close this dialogue? And what's next? Thank you, Cristina. Excellent. Excellent, everyone. This entire group, Margarita, Francis, yes, Cristina, everything fantastic. Margarita, just the comment Cristina made, you are right. People sometimes with so much money increase their suffering because they continue suffering, and you think you're going to be eternal because your money is eternal. Well, yes, I think this is true. Advantages and disadvantages on both sides. As you were saying, yes, thank you so much. Well, I really liked our dialogue, all your questions as well. I mean, this has been wonderful. And I want to thank you, please. We are going to be inviting you to other dialogues. This has been fantastic. I hope we can publish them. So much interest. I hope we can edit them. There's not so much information on so many publications. We don't have them on this type of issues. On the Mexican side, there are a lot of translations are there, yes. But this would be great for us to be able to disseminate this dialogue. I hope we can really, this is even surpassing our own expectations. Thank you, everyone. I want to thank everyone. Cristina, fantastic. Lilia, thank you so much for your interpretation. Rodrigo, thank you so much for helping us in the technical part of all this. And I want to thank all our collaborators, DMD, Maria, Hector, Galinda, thank you so much. And Espinosa Garcia Foundation sponsoring these dialogues. Yes, thank you. And all the participants, thank you so much. As Christina was saying, we have to reflect on these issues for us to be able to apply them in our own families, our own relatives, at home, our friends. And this is always very important. We are going to find many, many good surprises. We can lose this fear we have for death. Death is always there. And I do want to ask you to continue being with us. We have so many more things that we're planning for this type of dialogue. We have many surprises for the following dialogues. We are going to be announcing them. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, everyone, and hugs. Hugs.
Amparo, gracias.
Wonderful seeing you, Amparo, Francis, everyone. Christina, you're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.